You are wearing clothes right now. You have been wearing clothes for essentially your entire conscious life. It is so automatic that you almost certainly have never stopped to ask why. Not in the surface sense of warmth or modesty, but in the genuinely strange evolutionary sense. Why did a species that spent over 1.5 million years walking this planet completely naked suddenly decide one day to cover itself up? And why did that decision stick so completely that today the idea of not wearing clothes in public is not just uncomfortable, but in most societies actually illegal? The answer is not what anyone expects, and it starts with a species of insect that most people try very hard never to think about. The obvious explanation for clothing is cold. Humans spread from Africa into cold environments, so they needed insulation. It is clean, logical, and almost entirely wrong as an origin story. Not because cold is irrelevant, clothing absolutely helps with cold, but because the timeline does not support it. The genetic evidence for when humans first started wearing clothes consistently points to a period far earlier than any major cold climate migration. And it points to this date not from ancient fabric or animal skins, which rarely survive long enough to be found, but from something much more durable and much more surprising. Body lice. Body lice are not the same as head lice. They are closely related but biologically distinct in one critical way. Head lice live in human hair. Body lice live in fabric. Specifically, they require clothing to reproduce, laying their eggs in the fibers of whatever material the host is wearing. They cannot do this in bare skin, and they cannot sustain a population on a human who does not wear clothes. This means that body lice could not have existed as a separate species before humans started wearing something. The moment humans put on their first coverings, they created the precise ecological niche that body lice needed, and body lice immediately moved in. In the early 2000s, researchers including David Reed and Mark Stoneking used genetic sequencing to date the point at which body lice diverged from head lice the moment the two species split apart and began their separate evolutionary paths. What they found was striking. The divergence happened somewhere between 100,000 and 170,000 years ago. Some studies have placed the date at the higher end of that range. Either way, the number means the same thing. Humans were wearing some form of covering well over 100,000 years ago, possibly significantly longer. Here is where the cold explanation collapses. 170,000 years ago, anatomically modern humans were in Africa. They were not crossing glaciers or surviving in the tundra. Parts of East Africa where early humans lived were warm. Some were tropical. Cold climate necessity does not explain why a population living in sub-Saharan Africa reached for animal skins roughly 170,000 years ago when they had been fine without them for 1.5 million years before that. If clothing was purely a thermal response to cold, the genetic data from body lice should be pointing to a much more recent date aligned with the northward migration out of Africa that intensified somewhere around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago. It is not. It is pointing to Africa, to warmth, and to a period of time when something else must have been going on. The leading explanation among evolutionary anthropologists is social. Around 170,000 years ago, the archaeological record shows evidence of increasingly complex human behavior: ochre pigments used for body decoration, shell beads used as ornaments, the early stirrings of symbolic and group identity behavior. Humans were beginning to use visible markers to signal group membership. Who you were, which group you belonged to, what your status was. Body decoration and covering fit naturally into this emerging symbolic world. A group that began wearing the skin of a particular animal or using a particular material for covering was visibly distinct from a neighboring group that did not. Distinctiveness, once it started carrying social meaning, became something worth maintaining. Clothing began not as protection from the elements but as a form of language, a way of wearing your identity on the outside of your body where everyone could see it. Then, the climate changed. Around 70,000 years ago, a significant cooling event and the subsequent human migration into colder environments gave clothing a second purpose that rapidly became its most obvious and essential one. Warmth was not the origin. But warmth locked the behavior in permanently and drove the innovation that turned draping into construction. The progression from the earliest clothing to sewn garments took tens of thousands of years. The oldest needles made from bone that scientists have found date to around 50,000 years ago, found at sites across Europe and Siberia. These needles could pierce animal skin precisely enough to thread sinew through it, meaning humans were not just draping hides over themselves, but cutting and joining pieces together with deliberate intent. By 40,000 years ago, the evidence of sophisticated garment construction is clear. Flax fibers twisted into threads found in a cave in the Republic of Georgia date to approximately 34,000 years ago, suggesting that some form of woven material was being produced well before the end of the last ice age. By the time Ötzi the Iceman died in the Alps 5,300 years ago, he was wearing clothing constructed from 9 different animal species: coat, leggings, shoes, hat, each made from a different hide chosen for different properties. 1.5 million years naked. Then, something shifted in the social complexity of human groups, and within a geological instant, clothing went from nothing to permanent to sophisticated to legally required. The first person who ever put on a piece of animal skin was not cold. They were doing something far more human than staying warm. They were deciding who they were, and they were showing everyone around them what that looked like.